secret, and about like 20 pages takes place in Brooklyn. It being a comedy, I thought that would be appropriate since it's a road trip book. But going back to what you were saying, like when I'm doing autobio, obviously I'm mostly in New York, and I am like a huge walker. I mean, that's why I love that city so much, just to leave my house and not know where I'm going and just walk for miles, and just like every block you have something interesting to look at, and also just to be open to people there and have that infuse the stories as well.
Did you find that being part of your sort of routine? I'm sure during the pandemic that became sort of like a lifeline, but also suddenly you probably saw way more of your peers also doing that because there was not much else one could do except go outside and try to avoid one another.
Well, it's hard to know at the time, right? Because like I don't know what everyone else is doing, but I live in like kind of mid Brooklyn, and so I had Greenwood Cemetery right there, which is like my favorite place, and I'm right near Prospect Park as well. But Prospect Park became this kind of like rave scene after night, which was really great. But I liked the cemetery because and people are like, oh my god, the cemetery, but it's a national landmark cemetery, Greenwood, and they have like, you can go, bird watchers go there, and so that became my place during the pandemic that I was most excited about. But I also would do a thing where I would go on walks and be like, I need to find a street that I've never been on before in Brooklyn, and it's not that hard to do because you get so used to your little neighborhoods, and it's the same here, I'm sure. It's just like, this is my radius of where I'm going to go.
I mean, I remember being proud of, I never go north of 14th Street or south of Canal, and certainly at one point no one even went to Brooklyn because it was too hard to get a car back, and the trains were pretty spotty. I've heard a number of people write about your work and have called you an experimental cartoonist, and I don't know if I necessarily think that's true, but I was curious if you consider the work that you're doing experimental, or is it because it's so autobiographical, that's probably a misnomer, is it?
I think overall that's probably like a miscategorization, but I think, and these are images from the book that we're here tonight to talk about, but about 2014, I started a new style where I would just draw a page of comics every day, and sometimes it would just be a full-on painting or like just like weird notes, and I think that's where the experimental thing came from, because I think a lot of people before that hadn't seen my work, so I had more of like a Kandinsky approach to the page as opposed to like, doing a 6-panel page, which I'm doing now.
I'm glad you mentioned Kandinsky, in that, one of the things that really drew me to your work initially was, you right away I could see you had a very distinct color palette, and it runs through all of your work, and I'm curious, how long did it take you to sort of find that, or was it almost sort of organic because of the way you drew?
Yeah, I often probably sound like an idiot talking about it because, I have no training in colors. I just really love color, and you just find out through mistakes, I think, what works.
Happy accidents.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe because some of the style is minimalist, and like you said, you were doing this kind of step and repeat stuff, and that some of that was collected in earlier books. I think because we're here to talk about, Brooklyn's Not Secret, we should pivot to kind of music, which is another part of your personality. And I think where you and I have some stuff in common, I used to work at record labels in the 90s. Most of my work as a publisher is a lot more informed by my crate digging days as a record collector and person who worked at record shops, and you worked at Mondo Kim's in New York, which is this infamous place that, is no longer around, but was an incredible place to find out about things. So has music always been, I know this current book is a tour book, but has it always been, another thread of your life? I know you've played in bands for years as well.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's a bigger part of my life in terms of like the social aspect of it, because cartooning, you're just alone in your room doing whatever. It's like to write about your life as a cartoonist, which many people do, is like often very like navel gazing and boring, which I've also done as well. But I've been playing bands for years. I started playing guitar when I was 13. I basically kind of moved around in order to be close to places where like the music scene, like the reason I wanted to go to like San Francisco originally when I was like 15 was that I grew up at the Fireside Bowl in Chicago.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know what seems cooler? Gilman Street.
Yes.
And
well, and I think that was demonstrably true at one point.
no, it's 100% true. So I got on a bus and ended up like in Salt Lake City when I was like 15 years old. Trying to get to Gilman Street. So I've always felt like music has been this thing that's kind of like helped me navigate where I want to be.
That's a magical story because I have a similar, I'm a couple years older, but I went out on a tour with a band when I was about 16 and met Ferlinghetti in V-Vale and, you know, went to Epicenter, went to a Gilman meeting. You know, it was sort of like a rite of passage. And yeah, the Fireside Bowl, for those who don't know about it, it was kind of a hole-in-the-wall bowling alley, and, you know, they let this kid, Brian Peterson, book shows there, and then eventually it became like a legitimate venue. But for many years it was, you know, just people bowling on one side, and then there'd be, you know, some punk bands playing in the corner on the other side, and it certainly was very loosey-goosey about anyone could drink, and no one was being carded. It was pretty punk for its time.
Well, it was one of the only all ages venues in Chicago at the time, so just whatever show was going on there is what I'd go to, except for like stuff I grew up in Evanston, so I'd go like Knights of Columbus places for punk shows out there. But yeah, they wouldn't actually, there was a bar, and they wouldn't let us in the bar.
Oh yes, I remember. The bar.
They also weren't looking out, so
yes.
we would bring beer, run down the bowling lanes, and like hide it next to the pins, and drink that way, so.
Wow, so you grew up in Evanston. Evanston, for those who don't know it, is just outside of Chicago, like literally on the border. In fact, the L trains go there, and, you know, Northwestern University anchors a large chunk of the town. But, you know, Evanston is kind of like Oak Park near where I grew up. There was cool record stores, there were some cool venues. It was one of those sort of like almost the city type of places to grow up. So it's, you know, is that where you first sort of started stumbling into shops and buying comics and, you know, discovering all that stuff, you know, pre-internet, of course, or the internet was around, but not really what it is now, where you would just Google it?
Yeah, I mean, that was the funnest part, is like there was 3 record stores in the town that I grew up in. I would just like every Saturday just hit all 3. There's a Reckless Records, there was a place called Dr. Wax, there was a place called, actually there's 4 record stores, I can't remember.
Vintage Vinyl was one of them, or maybe I got it wrong.
Yeah, then there was Raw Records, and anyways, so actually fun enough, like the Reckless Records that was there, I realized like it got, like they left that space in the last, maybe like in the last 15 years. Anything in the last like 10 years, I'm like, it was yesterday. But so anyway, so I go back and I'm like, oh, what are they going to do with this space? And then they made it into a comic store, so I couldn't get angry about that.
Oh, yes. So the new book is a lot of fun if you ever played in a band or went on tour. Because I think, you know, you mentioned earlier it was a comedy. There's just a lot of, it kind of captures the hilarity of being on tour and just the weird things that the games that you play, the lists that you make, the obscure band references that you try to one-up your, you know, bandmates with. So a lot of this seemed like pulled from real life, and certainly the characters are a lot of the people in the new book kind of composites of people you actually know. Yeah,
absolutely. I think like each one is like maybe 3 or 4 people that I know. And when I had that conversation with Isaac, as you were mentioning, you know, he goes like, oh, like, you know, how did you come up with the characters? I'm like, man, like, I could just spin around and point, you know, like, there's this kind of guy.
Have you ever
like,
gotten in trouble for that? Where the person recognizes themselves and doesn't like it, which has happened with many novelists over the years as well.
Honestly, like, not really, because I feel like I'm pretty kind to my characters. I tried to make one character in this a villain at the beginning, and it turns out he's everyone's favorite character. Because he has this, like, you know, devil-may-care attitude, and everyone wants that, you know, it's like, but doesn't have that, you know, so that to me could be a negative thing, but to most people are like, yeah, that guy rules, you know.
Yeah, I think the book was almost therapeutic for me as someone who's like a road trip junkie myself, and had every shitty job on every shitty tour in the 90s when I worked at record labels, and I would just sort of like, I'll drive the van, I'll sell the merch in the back, I'll wrangle the band for sound check every day and make sure they eat. but the book was very cathartic because of the lockdown. I just was like, oh my God, like piling in a van, driving around a different city every day, finding the cool stuff in the town that you kind of want to check out or have heard about. Has that been the reaction to a lot of people that have read the new book, that it's just, it almost seems like a perfect post-COVID graphic novel because it's about togetherness and going places again?
Yeah, well, I started it in 2020, July 2020, and it was like exactly the opposite of what I was doing, which is like being alone in my room with a piece of paper. So I'm like, how do I, and when you're working on something and it's a visual, right? You know, it's like I'm having to put them on a tour, so it's like if they're going to be in this city, it's like where are they going to stop for barbecue? And so I'm like researching every day, like where would I stop for barbecue? And it became this thing where I'm like living vicariously through the characters. And then what I did was like I would just put up snippets of it on Instagram because, you know, in 2020 it was just like this endless like doom scrolling cycle. And I was like, I want to be like a positive element of this, and not that like, you know, that we talk about like relevance in art, and it's like there's nothing fucking relevant about this comic. It's but these things can coexist, right? You know, and during that time also I got really into like just like embracing my love of like the dumbest like cultural elements. Like I'm gonna watch every single Nick Cage movie. I'm gonna rewatch, you know, Wayne's World, and like, you know, listen to Nirvana every day just to keep sanity. So I felt like this book was a lot for me to keep sanity, but also like I started getting responses from people who are like, this is like the only thing I want to log into Instagram is see. And so that kept me going, you know, that kind of response.
I have to say, just I've always, when I see something that you put up that you're working on, it always like brings a smile to my face. But I mean, that was the good part of COVID, was seeing people create and then share it in a way that kind of made everyone feel better about doom scrolling all day and watching every episode of, you know, The Office or whatever people were doing. And I was sort of taking, you know, going down wormholes like that as well. You know, I've always found you to be like a really sort of gregarious and, you know, sort of social person, and sometimes that works against the stereotype of a comics artist, because, you know, where I grew up in Chicago, I'm a few years older than Leslie, but, you know, Chris Ware and Klaus were like sitting at Earwax Cafe, like not talking to anyone ever, and kind of, you know, not sneering at anyone, but just not being friendly enough where you would ever approach them and be like, hey man, how's it going? And they got free lunch because they designed the menu. So it was like an endless barter, where, you know, I would go there every day too. It was pretty good food, but you totally defy that stereotype in that. And I guess maybe it's from you playing in bands and, you know, having that be part of your social life, because the rest is this kind of solitary art in a way.
Yeah, and like, not to pat myself on the back too much, but I mean, there's been times, you know, going to comic conventions, and like there is like a very intense like cartoonist personality that's kind of like prevalent that I feel very different from. And I remember talking to, I published this book with John and Quarterly, but I published many books with Fantagraphics from Seattle, and Gary Groth, the editor there, and I would always talk, and I was like, man, we need an ambassador to the outside world for comics, and I nominated myself. I can actually talk to people, and he was like, I agree with you.
Yeah. No, because it's true. I'm blanking on it. Is it Harvey Pekar? You know, I can't, you know, they made that sort of movie about him, and I mean, that just came to mind. Yeah. And the, you know, the new book, I guess, you know, it has sort of like a group show kind of vibe with it, because of all these different characters. How did you know, you know, when you do a book like that, is there a lot of there's a lot of extra material and you have to sort of thin it down, because it's not necessarily a linear story because you're jumping to these different characters. There is one tour that's going on, but I guess the question buried in there is like, how do you know when you're done, when you have all these different characters? Was that a challenge for you with this book versus some of the other ones that came about differently?
Well, I would say like the first thing I did, I started the book, I'm about 15 pages in, I'm like, cool, it's going to be like 300 pages. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew it was going to be a tour. I knew there was like specific things that needed to happen in order for it to be, you know, realistic, you know, or to really like give you all essences of being on a tour. So what I did, the first thing I did is like just print out a map and just like mapped the whole tour, and then figure out like they need to do their laundry here, and like even just like silly stuff like that will like play off another part.
It sounds like from the beginning it was a comedy.
Yes, absolutely. And then I really wanted to give what it really is a character study. It's just like you meet these guys on page 1. You know, there's no, I use only dialogue and I don't use narration. So it's like, it's more like you're making a mini movie. And I think about like how my panels is like my eyes are the camera, right?
Yeah,
So,
I mean, the way you write in pencil, it does have a storyboard vibe to it a little bit. This book more so than others, but I found that was like a really good way to digest the dialogue.
yeah, I mean, I think that's just the style. It wasn't really particular to this book, but it's because I do the text last, so I have to do it in pencil, because if it doesn't fit, I have to like erase it. Whereas like a famous thing in comics is that you do the text first, and then you figure out how to like what the face should look like as they're saying that, you know, kind of like if you're acting. Like I act out stuff before I like look in the mirror and page. Like because facial expression can mean so many different things with a sentence, you know. It's like it can make it funny or it can make it sad, depending on the way someone looks when they say it. So it's like you're making all those decisions the same way like a filmmaker does, I would say, or an actor does. I forget the original part of that question because I had something to say to that.
No, it was just how do you know when you're done, because you know the characters could go in all these directions, and you know it seemed like you know the Hemingway principle was employed, where it's like what you took out helped illuminate the characters more.
Oh yeah, well I had this whole backstory for the whole band. You know, it's like I imagine like 2 of the characters met in a record store. They actually had a romantic relationship, and so like you see them being the closest in the book, but you don't find out until the last 15 pages that they had a romantic relationship, which then illuminates everything that happened. So like I think the end of the book was about wrapping up like, oh, like here's your reward for reading this, and hopefully the whole thing's rewarded because it's a comedy. But it's like here's your emotional payoff. Is that you now get the insight of like the emotional aspect of all the characters and how they relate to each other.
So this is a process question, but I guess maybe some other people wonder about this too. Some writers have to do one book at a time, and there's no way to kind of have multiple planes of existence. And I imagine that might be true for some graphic novelists too. Nick Gernasso was here maybe 6 months ago, and you know, we're friends of friends, and he's very strict and like, no, I can only do this one book at a time, and until I finish it, I can't even start any other ideas. And I'm curious with you, like, do you have multiple things going, and then you know, one gets far enough along, so then that becomes the next book, but you have maybe 3 or 4 books going at the same time?
No, I'm exactly like Nick. I just like start page 1, by page 30, it seems like I'm still interested in it, then it's like that's all I can do, because it's such a laborious process. And I even like set up my days like very strictly. I can only draw 5 hours a day because otherwise like my hand gets all messed up. So you know, I like eat certain things. Like I had a whole period of time during this book when I was trying to finish it where I would eat like a lot of sweet potatoes, which I hate, but I heard they're like really good for like time release like fiber, so it's like you're not too full because then you get sleepy, but you're not hungry, so you're not shaky. So it's like even eating becomes this way of working. You know, it's like everything you're doing is about the work. And I know Nick is the same actually. It's interesting because talking to him, for example, we had the exact same take on something where it's like, because I'm sitting at a table and I'm just looking at this tiny like piece of paper, it's like I go to like Dwayne Reed or like in a store to get toothpaste, and I'm just like, my mind is blown because I'm like, everything is 3D now, and like Crest has all these sparkly things on the package, and I get so stoked, you know. And he was like, I hate that, you know? He's like I leave and it's like everything's 3D, like this is too confusing for him. So it's like we have the same thing, but like totally different emotional reactions to it, you know, where I'm stoked and it bums him out.
You probably are indulging in a little bit of marijuana maybe too beforehand, and maybe Nick is not doing that.
No, not at all.
No. Sorry, I didn't mean to insinuate, but yeah, I got a sense from I did an interview with Nick recently, and yeah, he doesn't even really like to go outside at all.
No.
I mean, he does live in Chicago, so I don't blame him. You know, the weather there is quite dreadful. So I could talk to Leslie for hours because she's endlessly fascinating to me, but I know some of her friends and some fans are here, and so we should probably, open that up, and then she's going to sign some books afterwards. Does anyone have a question